on a new community solar financial model and electricity bill calculator updates. These webinars are free registration at the SAM website, and you can find past webinar recordings such as our merchant plant financial model and marine energy performance model webinars at the SAM website as well. Those of you that are joining us live on the call today, we invite you to use the question box on your GoToWebinar, either desktop application or instant join viewer. Please type your questions in the chat. A member of the SAM team will try to answer your question, or we'll bring it to one of our presenters at the end of the webinar to address it during the webinar. For those of you that aren't familiar, the System Advisor model, more commonly referred to as SAM, is free software that enables detailed performance and financial analysis for renewable energy systems. This is done first by defining weather data such as solar resource data for PV systems for a PV plus battery combined system. You can define your system specifications such as your PV system size and your battery specifications, any system losses you would expect, and that gets you electricity production results and annual, monthly, and hourly outputs of electricity. These performance results are then combined with detailed cost inputs for your system, information about your compensation or project revenue, financing considerations, and incentives such as tax incentives to get economic outputs such as your levelized cost of energy, net present value, payback period, and overall revenue of the project. So in our webinar today, I'll be giving a quick intro into the SAM battery modeling capabilities before going into a quick overview of the different inputs in the battery models in SAM, particularly those inputs that are important to the levelized cost of storage calculation, which is a new financial metric calculation that is going to be in the next version of SAM. I'll then pass it off to Brian to go over some new battery dispatch algorithms. And then finally, Dries will go over some changes to the battery lifetime modeling capabilities options in SAM. So the SAM battery models, we currently allow for the modeling of lithium ion, lead acid, and flow battery chemistries. These batteries can be AC or DC connected. We have detailed battery lifetime degradation models and also detailed battery dispatch modeling algorithms that can affect how the battery behaves over the full project lifetime and how accurately they can meet the load as the years pass in the project. You can specify detailed battery replacements on a set schedule, or you can set the battery to automatically have replacements at a specified remaining capacity percentage. There are also detailed voltage modeling, the ability for users to input battery losses and battery temperature calculations that go into some of our degradation modeling as well. These batteries can be modeled in front of the electricity meter, or FOM, front of meter, and behind the meter. For front of meter batteries, the different battery dispatch options are based on options that include a look ahead forecast, a new PV smoothing algorithm that Brian will go into more detail on, or manually defined dispatch where the user puts in a dispatch schedule of when the battery can charge and discharge. The cost of grid charging for the battery, which is an important input to the levelized cost of storage calculations that I will discuss in a few slides, are based primarily on a PPA rate, unless for some financial models, there's the option to specify these costs through utility rate definition. And the revenue from these front of meter batteries is based on the battery energy discharge to the grid. For behind the meter batteries, the dispatch options include a peak shaving algorithm aiming to reduce the demand peaks throughout the year, custom power target inputs defined by the user for hourly battery targets, a price signal forecast algorithm that Brian will talk about in some more detail, and again, manual dispatch option as well. The grid charging for behind the meter batteries, it will be based on the utility rate definition specified by the user, whatever utility rate is for your model project. And the revenue for behind the meter batteries is based on battery discharge to the load, thus reducing your overall utility bill. Next, I will switch over to our SAM user interface to give a quick overview of some of the important inputs to the battery model. I will start at our battery cell and system page. This is a PV battery system with a single owner financial structure. We can begin at the top where we have our different options for battery chemistries, for different lithium ion batteries, lead acid batteries, or flow batteries. Next, you can set your desired size of your system with a kilowatt power definition and either a specified hours of storage definition or total kilowatt hours for your battery battery system. You can define characteristics of your single battery cells, and then this can lead to computed battery properties of the actual performance, actual capacity and power of your battery, depending on how many cells are needed to meet your desired power and capacity. And you have DC and AC definitions of that power as well. The batteries can be DC or AC connected, and with either option, there are the relative conversion efficiencies from DC to AC, or if it's on the DC side, inverter considerations. There are several options for battery lifetime degradation modeling that I will let Doris go into more detail on later in the presentation. The option to specify your battery replacements, either turning off replacements, replacing at a specified remaining capacity of the battery system, or replacing on an annual schedule where you specify what percentage of the capacity you want replaced in each year. There have been some changes to the battery voltage model with the introduction of a cutoff cell voltage input that makes the voltage modeling more accurate to actual battery behavior, particularly at high depths of discharge. There is the ability to input battery losses and battery temperature modeling as well. Next, we can go over to the different battery dispatch options, where we can see we have the min and max charge states of the battery at any given time and the initial state of charge, and the minimum amount of time that must be spent at any one charge state. And then the different dispatch modeling strategies, where this radio choice here for the different options automatically loads and unloads the important inputs for that dispatch option. So we have automated dispatch options, PV smoothing algorithm that Brian will go over, and a manual dispatch where there is a calendar schedule that the user specifies to set up their battery discharge. Finally, I'll go over some important cost inputs that are very relevant to the levelized cost of storage calculations. Specifically for battery capital costs, we have line items for a $1 per kilowatt hour capacity charge and a $1 per kilowatt power charge. And these scale by the size of the system to get you a battery capital cost. You can specify a percentage of the indirect capital costs that are attributed to specifically to the battery system. And these values are summed along with the sales tax considerations to get a total installed cost related to only the battery system. There are also new battery O&M outputs where you can specify specific O&M costs relative to the battery system. There is a fixed annual cost input per year, a fixed cost by capacity, variable cost by generation, in this case, battery energy discharged, and you can specify the cost for replacing the batteries in terms of replacing the energy capacity here as well. Next, I'll go back to our slide deck to go over the levelized cost of storage calculations. So the levelized cost of storage is a financial metric that can be thought of as similar to the levelized cost of energy. The calculation is the total storage lifecycle cost divided by the total electricity discharged from the storage system. This LCOS is important when considering different storage systems with different costs, but similar use cases and similar dispatch strategies, such as comparing batteries to hydro storage or other types of storage. The equation here, we're showing the different cost inputs in the numerator. We start off with our investment costs. That's our initial installation cost in year 0. We have the net present value of the different O&M cost categories that I showed in the SAM user interface. per year. There's the different battery charging costs, and that the cost to charge the battery will vary depending on whether you're charging from this PV system versus from the grid. And there's an end of life cost, which is the battery salvage value cost in the last year of the project, which is another input that is in SAM that you can specify what percentage of the capacity remaining are you able to salvage at the end of the project. All these cost terms are divided by the present value of the battery energy discharge across the full lifetime of the project. So the discharge in each year brought back to the base year. And that gets you a levelized cost of storage in dollars per megawatt hour. So why is the LCOS a valuable metric? As time goes on, batteries and other storage technologies are anticipating improvements in round trip efficiency and in cost considerations, both capital and operating costs. And so the LCOS can kind of capture how the efficiencies and costs improve for batteries as time goes on. As I mentioned, this LCOS is helpful to compare different technologies meeting the same service. So there's similar dispatch, similar duration, similar cycling considerations, but different storage technologies. There is a new US Department of Energy storage shot goal based on an LCOS price target. This storage shot report is linked at the bottom of the slide. The LCOS can be helpful to examine the impact of low electricity charging prices on the cost effectiveness of the storage. And there are some caveats with this metric. So the LCOS is use case dependent. You don't want to compare two types of batteries serving very different purposes. And you don't want to compare the LCOS price to the wholesale or residential electricity prices. Some quick clarification on battery charging cost. If the battery is charged from the PV system, we calculate that based on a estimated LCOE of only the PV system, which is based on a ratio of capital cost and LCOE between the PV plus the battery, so the entire system, and the PV only, which gets us a calculated adjusted LCOE for only the PV system, which is then used as the cost to charge the battery from the PV system in a given year. If we are charging the battery from the grid, the cost of that charging can depend on whether we're specifying those charges by a PPA rate, in which case we know the PPA price in each year and can use that price to determine the cost of charging based on how much is charged from the grid to the battery. If we're using a electricity rate, then we can look at our utility bill, take the energy charge component of the bill in a given month of each year of the project, add in any annual true-up statements that could occur in that given month, and use that to determine the total cost of charging the battery from the grid in that month of that year. Some quick results to give you an idea of what this metric could look like. We have 4 different utility scale batteries here, 2 with a manual dispatch schedule aiming to charge during the day and discharge from the high price times of 4 p.m. to 11 p.m. And an automatic look ahead schedule aiming to maximize revenue regardless of how much the battery cycles. So you can see for both the 2-hour and 4-hour battery cases, the LCOS is a little bit lower for the manual cases because there is more battery cycling and thus more energy discharge from the battery. But you can see in the right-hand column, this does not have a big effect on the overall LCOE of the PV plus the battery system. And this image on the bottom gives you an idea of the different cost components attributing to this LCOS cost and the discharge that accounts for the LCOS calculations. And these cash flows will be available in the SAM results to kind of see how your different battery expenses are affecting the LCOS of the system. Finally, for a comparison of commercial scale batteries, we have some analysis here that Brian will go into more detail in and the effects of the different dispatch options. We have 4 different cases here, a price signals dispatch algorithm that is looking at prices and a look ahead forecast to maximize revenue, and a peak shaving algorithm that's aiming to reduce demand peaks. And both of these were evaluated for a San Diego hospital, a commercial sized building load, one using the investment tax credit and thus no grid charging, and the second allowing for grid charging but not taking advantage of the investment tax credit provided. And you can see comparing these 4 cases that for price signals, we have a lower LCOS when you allow for grid charging because there's more battery cycling, but this does not reflect the improved performance of the whole PV plus battery system, with the LCOE getting higher and the net present value getting lower. And you can see that the grid charging for price signals has the lowest LCOS of all these systems, which just shows the impact of increased battery cycling on the result of the LCOS. And with that, I will hand it off to Brian to go over some new battery dispatch algorithms available in SAM.
Thanks, Matt. So we'll be covering both the behind-the-meter dispatch algorithms first and the new front-of-meter dispatch algorithm second. So let's start with the behind-the-meter algorithms. So behind-the-meter batteries in SAM are used to reduce a residential or commercial building's utility bill. So in addition to the system performance properties, this means we have to specify a load profile as an input and also a utility rate. So SAM has an interface that allows you to specify a customized utility rate, or they can be downloaded from OpenEI's utility rate database. And when attempting to reduce that utility bill, there are typically 2 major sources of savings. One can do energy arbitrage versus time of use rates, so load shifting, or one can do peak demand reduction versus a utility rate with demand charges. This slide summarizes the behind-the-meter dispatch modes in SAM. So starting with peak shaving, which is the default for the commercial financial model, it includes as inputs the PV and load forecast, which can either be specified as perfect look ahead, 1-day look behind, or coming up in the new release, a custom weather file in order to reduce peak demand charges. And it uses those forecasts to specify what we refer to as a grid power target, which means that if the expected grid power is above that target, then the battery will discharge in order to shave the peak. And if the expected grid power is below that target, then the battery will charge in order to prepare for the next peak. And you can read more about how SAM schedules those periods in Nick DiOrio's 2017 technical report. We also specify an option or allow an option such that the user can specify those grid targets manually, either monthly or on a time series basis. And that allows to include other constraints that the forecast algorithms may be unaware of, or perhaps include some outside optimization. We also have a custom dispatch option, which goes to an even finer level of detail, where you can specify power flows to and from the battery on a time-step by time-step basis, either charging or discharging. And this is typically used with PySAM or some sort of outside optimization, such as React Lite. Next up is the manual dispatch option, which allows the user to specify the schedule by hour and month. So which hours correspond to charging, which hours correspond to discharging, and what % of the battery capacity to either charge or discharge in each hour. And that's typically used for energy arbitrage against an energy-only utility rate. And then finally, the new algorithm in the most recent release of SAM is the price signals dispatch. The previous set of algorithms only looked at PV and load forecasts. They didn't translate anything into costs. So in addition to the PV and load forecast, this algorithm includes the utility rate such that the battery's discharging can be targeted for the periods of highest cost. We find that this typically works well in a use case that requires a mix of time of use charges and demand charges. And since we're converting things to costs, it also works well in cases where we have to consider battery degradation. We presented this work recently at the Photovoltaic Specialist Conference, and a preprint of that paper is available freely for download from the NREL website. So I mentioned on the previous slide, the price signals dispatch converts things into costs. So that allows us to specify an additional input, the cycle degradation penalty, which basically allows the algorithm to determine whether or not a given cycle is worth it. Will the amount of cost savings from that cycle of the battery outweigh any future impacts of battery replacement or augmentation based on the degradation of that cycle? So this can either be automatically computed based on SAM's estimates of battery degradation caused by the cycle, or specified on a $ per cycle kilowatt hour basis. So for the case study that Matt mentioned a few slides ago, we were looking at a San Diego hospital with a simulated load profile for a San Diego hospital. The utility rate that we use in the case study includes both time of use periods for energy charges and demand charges. And the highest cost energy is from 4 p.m. to 9 p.m. We sized the PV and battery system for this case study using React Lite, and then compared the performance of the various SAM dispatch algorithms. The price signals dispatch achieved the highest net present value despite allowing higher peak demand charges than the peak shaving dispatch. So the year one dispatch of the algorithms is shown in the heat maps below, where yellow is discharging, blue is charging, and green means the battery is idle. And the x-axis is day of the year, and y is hour of the day. So the manual dispatch was specified to discharge during that 4 p.m. to 9 p.m. case. And this is the case with PV only charging and the investment tax credit. So the blue indicates charging when PV is available. Peak shaving dispatch tends to discharge both in the morning when there's a morning peak before there's significant PV generation, and then later into the evenings than just the high cost energy period. But there's a lot of days where it's not discharging during that high cost energy period. So then price signals dispatch is doing a bit of both. It is really targeting a lot of discharging for that high cost period, but then will also frequently go later into the night and meet morning peaks. This set of charts zooms in on a single day of dispatch. So the black line is the total load in the load profile. Blue is the battery's discharge. Yellow is PV generation, and red is energy drawn from the grid. So if you sum the blue, yellow, and red lines, you'll see what's meeting the load at any given hour. And in this particular day, the battery doesn't charge at all. The PV never exceeds the load to the point where the battery is able to charge. So the manual dispatch allows a relatively high peak of around 700 kilowatts in the morning, and then reduces the grid power during that high energy cost period to 0. The peak shaving dispatch has its grid power target set around 400 kilowatts. So it is shaving that morning peak to 400 kilowatts, but then it's still drawing 400 kilowatts from the grid during the high cost energy period. Price signals dispatch discharges during that morning peak, reducing most of it to 0. There's 1 hour that's about 570 kilowatts, so that's that higher peak demand than what peak shaving dispatch allows. But then it is reducing the draw from the grid to 0 during that high cost period, which results in a lower overall cost to the system. Moving on to front of meter batteries. For the front of meter systems, we're looking at what the revenue would be like for an independent power producer selling energy to the grid. Previous algorithms looked at maximizing revenue for time of delivery in a PPA. This new algorithm is looking to smooth the PV for improved ramp rate control. So a potential issue is that rapid changes in PV, it would provide issues, or cause issues for grid stability. And some relevant markets and system operators are starting to include penalties for that type of ramp. If a power plant changes its output by, for example, 10% of its nameplate capacity within 1 minute, they would be assigned some financial penalty as a part of their arrangement. So this algorithm looks to use the battery in order to prevent those types of penalties. And a note here is that we're looking at ramp rate control, which has smaller storage requirements than firming. Firming is looking to keep the output constant over time. By looking at the rate of change of the output, we're able to do this with smaller storage. This algorithm was originally developed by the Electric Power Research Institute. Daniel Fregosi, Michael Bolin, and Will Hobbs also had a paper on this at the Photovoltaic Specialist Conference, and their Python code is available at the GitHub link below. So the SAM implementation is in C++, and the Python implementation is available from the Every GitHub. So the controller that they implemented for PV smoothing is based on a proportional plus integral, or PI, feedback controller. The primary objective of the controller is such that the output power should track the PV power without exceeding the ramp rate and the storage's state of charge boundaries. Assuming that objective can be met, the controller will also attempt to return the storage to a specified resting state of charge in order to prepare for near future ramping. So you can see that in the chart on the bottom right. The blue line is the PV power, the green line is the storage power, and the yellow line is the overall output power of the system. So more or less throughout the day, the orange line is matching the blue line, but a little bit smoother due to the battery output, except for an overshoot that happens in the late morning. And what's happening there is that the controller sees that the PV plant output is going to slowly increase, and it will overshoot that in order to reduce the state of the charge of the battery and prepare for future ramping. The controller can be run both as a feedback controller, but it can also be run with a forecast. So the advantage of using the forecast is that it gives the controller an opportunity to begin ramping before the PV output power ramps. And using the controller as a feedback controller has a higher power and energy requirement for the battery. So that's shown in the chart at the bottom right. The black line is the simulated PV output, where there's a decrease of about 100 megawatts within about 4 minutes, which would violate some of the ramp rate controls in some markets. And so the red line is the feedback controller attempting to reduce that ramp to something that would fall within those ramp rate controls. So in this particular case, that requires 75 megawatts of battery power and 12.5 megawatt hours of capacity in order to meet those ramp rate requirements. The chart on the right has the same black and red lines as the chart on the left, but also includes a blue line where the controller is using the forecast in order to start the same ramp a little bit sooner. And by starting that ramp sooner, it is able to decrease the power and energy requirements. The power requirements are reduced to 40 megawatts, and the energy storage requirements are reduced to 3.5 megawatt hours. This screenshot shows the implementation of the controller in the SAM user interface, allowing for some of these control parameters. The caveat being that this is, like many of the things we're showing today, from a development version of SAM and may not be final and is subject to change prior to release. But you can see that some, typically within SAM, the blue inputs are calculated either from another page or similar, and the white inputs are inputs for this page. And so, for example, we're pulling the weather file time step from the location and resource page, and this algorithm needs to be run with short time steps. The ramp interval has to be less than 30 minutes. So we're specifying here the ramp time step multiplier in order to specify the ramp interval. The maximum ramp rate is something that you would find from a market operator's agreement. The battery resting state of charge is a control parameter that we discussed previously. And then there's some other inputs such as whether this overall system should have an upper or lower bound relative to the capacity, whether the inverter should be used to curtail violations, and then we provide whether or not to use that forecast and 2 options for the forecast. Either you can use a perfect look-ahead forecast, or you can provide a custom weather file in order to help quantify the impact of uncertainty in the forecast. And then finally, on the right, we have some of the control multipliers. So in addition to providing a Python implementation of the code, the EPRI GitHub repository provides some code for a bisecting search algorithm to tune those control multipliers for a given system and weather file. We'd also like to show some of the new outputs associated with this controller in SAM. So these are 1-minute weather files, so they can be a little bit slow to run, so we ran them ahead of time. First, we'll show an example output with a forecast. So given the constraints provided on the PV smoothing page, with the forecast, this particular system, which I think has about 0.2 of an hour of storage, it has 13 violations of that 5% per nameplate ramp rate interval. And then we provide some additional outputs such as the energy to grid. Many of these can also be seen on the time series page, allowing you to see when the violations occur and some of the more detailed control for variables used within the algorithm. We also ran a case with no forecast. And so that's just unchecking the forecast box on the input side. And in this case, there were 20 violations. So we can see that for the same battery system, including the forecast decreases the number of violations. So with that, we're excited to include these additional algorithms in SAM for additional use case. And I'd like to hand things off to Doris to talk about new lifetime models.
Thanks. I'll be going over some battery lifetime model features that were added for lithium-ion chemistries. So for lithium-ion chemistries for stationary storage, there are 3 main chemistries that have achieved mass market scale. This is NCA, NMC, and LFP. NCA can be found in EVs. NMC and LFPs are in both EVs and stationary applications. And then we also have a section for other chemistries. And while this could include alternate chemistries such as lead acid or flow batteries, it could also include LMO LTO, which is a high rate, very stable chemistry. So on the bottom right, there's a comparison of different materials for lithium-ion batteries. And when selecting a battery for a specific application, important factors include energy density, cost, lifetime, safety, and the lack or presence of critical materials. This is a background about battery degradation models. Accurate battery lifetime predictions for techno-economic analysis is important. It helps reduce costs by reducing the battery size needed to satisfy warranties and guarantee performance. It also informs replacements in discounted cash flow analysis and decisions on second life. The methods for these degradation models usually involve creating a matrix of test conditions from which you get a small but well-designed lab data set under controlled and accelerated test conditions. From there, physics-based and data-driven modeling can be informed by these measurements to allow predictive models for extrapolating to time and conditions unseen in the tests. The development and use of these models is challenging because end-use applications have uncontrolled operating conditions, which can be very different from the controlled conditions within the lab data set. So in the battery model in SAM, the life models are integrated with the technology models, the dispatch and financial models, allowing for an integrated techno-economic and performance. And in particular, I'll be talking about updated life models for NMC graphite, LFP graphite, and LMO LTO. So as a backup, the original SAM battery lifetime model involves this calendar cycle input. When this option is selected in the GUI, the model is broken up into 2 complementary pieces, the cycle degradation and the calendar degradation. And then the minimum degradation from each is then the overall degradation applied to the battery. The cycle degradation is input as a table in which the depth of discharge and the cycles elapsed give you a capacity percent. And then the calendar degradation can be input in 2 different ways if selected. The first one here, called lithium-ion model, refers to a rate equation that was based on lithium ion and is a function of state of charge and temperature. But this is essentially a parameterized equation to which you can fit the behavior. Alternatively, you can use a custom degradation lookup table where you report the calendar age versus the capacity retention percent. The new models are chemistry-specific lithium-ion degradation models. The two of these, NMC graphite and LMO LTO, are implemented behind the GUI and do not use the cycle degradation and calendar degradation inputs. Instead, they are equations that are more complex than lookup tables and are not reported in the GUI. So for the NMC graphite lifetime model, it's based off of a paper by Candler-Smith at NREL called Life Prediction Model for Grid-Connected Lithium-Ion Battery Energy Storage Systems. And on the right here, we see a comparison of the SAM implementation of this model with the original NREL model implementation, as well as the lab collected RPT data. The graph on the top shows cells which were cycled. So each cell is tested under different temperatures and different depth of discharge. The graph on the bottom shows cells under the storage conditions in which the cells were kept at a constant temperature and state of charge. And then the capacity retention over time was measured on a about monthly basis and is reported in the circle markers. For comparison, we can see the original implementation in the dashed line and the SAM implementation in the solid line. And we see very good agreement among the three. In terms of some differences between the two implementations, we see some difference at beginning of life, and also for the cell 6 and 7, which are at 0 degrees C. This is due to how SAM handles time differently as it simulates, but it's also unlikely to be a big effect on stationary applications, as usually batteries should be kept within 19 to 25 degrees C. And so we would rarely trigger this as part of the model. For the LFP graphite lifetime model, we did not implement the equations directly from this paper by Naumann called Analysis and Modeling of Cycle Aging of a Commercial LFP Graphite Cell. Instead, we extracted the data from the graphs, such as the one shown to the bottom right here, and created a lookup table that we then use as inputs to the cycle degradation model. And so you can see here that the bottom right original data is plotted against full energy cycles on the x-axis, whereas in SAM, the x-axis is the cycle number, and these are cycles that occur at the specified depth of discharge. And so that's why the two graphs look different. And also, since this model is using a lookup table rather than the algebraic equations, that results in less granularity and makes it more difficult for interpolation and extrapolation. Finally, we have an LMO LTO life model. This one is being developed as an ongoing piece of the behind the meter storage consortium project. Testing and life modeling is being performed by INL, Matt Shirk and others, and NREL, Paul Gasper, Candler Smith and others. And so as more data becomes available, the model will be improved upon. But what we have here is a similar comparison of the lab collected RPT data in circles, the original MATLAB model in dashed, and the SAM implementation in the solid lines. And we see here that the agreement is also very good. In terms of the capacity degradation, it's much less than the two models that we saw before. But on the other hand, the data is still rather limited. There's only been, a maximum of 150 days and only a few data points collected so far. So we look forward to improving these models in the future. So here's an example simulation of the effect of the battery chemistry choice and the associated degradation on an energy system. So here we have an energy system with 328 kilowatts PV and a 382 kilowatt battery. The energy system is a behind the meter system that's serving a load that's being reported in gray in the graph on the right. This graph is showing a week in the middle of the year, and it shows the load in gray. The load is a medium office building with 150 kilowatt DC EV charging. And so we can see that the load goes from 0 to about 450 kilowatts, and it's also very variable. It's got a lot of high peaks. And then in yellow, we have the PV production. And then in green, we have the optimal battery dispatch that was optimized against a specific utility rate in order to reduce the electricity bill. So what we can see from this battery dispatch profile is that there are many small cycles throughout the day. And in general, the battery is quite heavily used, like 6 out of 7 days this week. And in the entire year, about 120 full energy cycles have elapsed. And so with this very specific battery load profile, we can see what happens with replacements if we say that we will replace the battery at 60% of original capacity. Given an NMC graphite battery, we see that the replacements happen around year 7, year 13, and right before the beginning of year 20. In contrast, LFP graphite has about 89.8% capacity retention, and LMO LTO has about 97.24% capacity retention. So throughout the 20 years of simulation, the effects of the relative capacity of the battery and the number of replacements required can have multiple effects, such as the O&M cost, the ability of the battery to continually reduce the demand at the same level as it degrades. So the ability for the battery to meet its performance requirements, and also the salvage value at the end. And therefore it could affect metrics such as LCOS and LCOE. So in summary, we have several new features: the levelized cost of storage metric. We have a new behind the meter price signals dispatch algorithm, as well as a front of the meter PV smoothing dispatch algorithm. and several chemistry-specific battery lifetime models. Upcoming, we have a standalone battery model, and we will also be making a new release this fall. With that, I'd like to thank you for your time and attention, and be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Doris, Brian, and Matt. I think we've had some questions that have been answered in the question box, but if anyone has an additional question for the team, please go ahead and type it, or you could raise your hand and we could unmute your line if you wanted to ask it by voice.
While people are typing their questions, I will make a note that I forgot to mention during the LCOS portion of the presentation. There is an additional input for salvage value specific to the storage, the battery storage, which is taking a percentage of your storage replacement cost in the last year of the project. And then that number is adjusted for what capacity is left from the battery due to the lifetime degradation. So that's an additional new input that will be in the next release as well.
If there aren't further questions, we'll be posting a recording of this webinar along with a copy of the presentation slides and any additional supporting materials on the SAM website. We'll have them up here on the events page for a little while, and then later on under battery videos, we have links to all of our battery related webinars. And if you have questions that come up later, feel free to post them on the forum on the SAM website, or you can also email us at sam.support@nrel.gov, and we'd be happy to continue the conversation by email or on the forum. So I don't think I see any additional questions. So I think we can call it a day. Thanks everyone for calling in today, and thanks to the presenters for a very informative webinar. We look forward to hearing from you soon, either on the forum, by email, or at another one of our webinars or roundtables. Take care everyone and have a nice day.